program. Sorry about that. We are recording now. Um, Disbursements. Home is a reimbursement program, so that's how you'll get your money back. And then amendments and renewals, how you renew tenants for additional assistance. So the purpose of this webinar is to bring awareness to tenant-based rental assistance, or TBRA, as you'll hear us say throughout the presentation, and also to review the program's rules and regulations that are associated with TBRA. We hope that this will provide more insight and guidance on how to actually administer a TBRA contract. Today, we're going to do an in-depth look of tenant-based rental assistance, but I wanted to provide an overview. TBRA provides monthly assistance for individual households that are at or below 60% of the area median income. Assistance can move with the household and varies based on income and rent considerations. It is not intended to be emergency housing, but temporary housing, and is designed to provide assistance to households on the Section 8 voucher waitlist. So who can apply? Not-for-profit organizations can apply, units of local government, that's like cities, towns, and villages, and public housing authorities. And again, this is an in-depth look of TBRA. We will have 2 application webinars coming up in the future, and we'll talk about those at the end and the dates of those. For now, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah to begin the program's rules and regulations.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks to Jessica for leading our introduction there. Courtney and I will be trading off to cover different sections of the presentation since we do have a lot of information we'll be covering today. As with all home programs, there are lots of program rules and regulations when administering home TBRA. These are all covered in the general admin plan as well as the TBRA admin plan. Current TBRA administrators should be referring to these frequently throughout the term of their contract. If you are on this webinar because you are interested in applying for home TBRA, the information in the admin plans are essential when writing a competitive application. So if you haven't already started to review those documents, you will want to prioritize that. Before getting into project requirements, we are going to start with 4 key programmatic requirements, which are eligible cost, Tier 1 environmental review, the tenant selection plan, and the affirmative marketing plan. Next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so the first one we will review is cost, or what can and cannot be paid for with home funds. TBRA administrators have some flexibility and options with how they want to structure their program based on the eligible cost. Program can be specific to one of these options or encompass them all. At the time of application and upon starting your TBRA program, you should have a solid understanding of what types of assistance you will provide based on the needs of your community. So eligible and costs include monthly rental subsidy, which can be used to cover the first month's rent or provide up to 24 months of assistance at a time. Utility assistance, this must be combined with rental assistance or security deposit. You cannot solely provide utility assistance. Home TBRA can be used to provide a security deposit. This can be standalone assistance or combined with monthly rental subsidy. We've had some interest in providing security deposits and first month's rent, which is allowable, but the rental assistance must be the subsidized amount, not the full rent. One thing to note is that home requires a lot of paperwork and documentation. Setting a household up for a security deposit and first month's rent requires the same amount of work as setting them up for 12 to 24 months of assistance. So when thinking about what kind of assistance you're going to provide, think about your organization's capacity to administer the various types of assistance. Ineligible costs. Home cannot be used to duplicate assistance, meaning if the tenant already receives a rental subsidy that reduces the tenant's rent to 30% of their income, such as Housing Choice Voucher, Section 8, they would not be eligible for home assistance. TBRA cannot be used to help with relocation costs or moving expenses. TBRA cannot be used for overnight or temporary shelter, and TBRA cannot be used to pay arrears. The tenant must be current on their rent, otherwise they are not eligible for home funds. Next slide, please. I just noticed in the chat somebody made a comment that it's difficult to hear, so is that the case for everyone? Courtney, Jessica, can you guys hear me?
I can hear okay. Maybe try picking up your microphone and bringing it closer to your mouth, like on your headphones.
Okay. Okay. Let's move. Okay, so now we're on to environmental review. The TBRA environmental review is tiered and comprised of two parts, just like any other home activity. The Tier 1 reviews the overall program and allows for the commitment of HUD funds to the contract. You cannot begin your program until you have received Tier 1 clearance. The Tier 2 reviews each activity or address, allowing for setup in IDIS, which we will discuss later in the presentation. Once awarded, TBRA administrators will work with our environmental unit, who will assist and guide you through the environmental processes. Again, you must receive Tier 1 approval before you can commit any home funds. Next slide. Okay, moving on to the tenant selection plan. This specifies how households will be selected for participation in your program. It must identify the 8 items listed on the screen. The selection plan is essentially the roadmap for how you will run your program. For current TBRA administrators, your tenant selection plan will or has been reviewed as part of the first file review. For those interested in applying for TBRA, you should develop your tenant selection plan prior to applying for funds. So now we'll just go over the components. Income, this one's pretty easy, as home regulations specify TBRA recipients must be at or below 60% AMI. Preferences for applicants. If you included any in your home application, such as homeless or disabled populations, you must specify this in your tenant selection plan. Application selection. You must document how you will select your applicants, such as a waiting list, Section 8 waiting list, or referrals. Notice of rejection. LPAs must provide written notice detailing the rejection and retain the copies in the program files. Reasonable accommodations must be provided to any applicant if requested. Tenant education. As the LPA, you must discuss shopping and selection of units, dealing with landlords, and fair housing protections with each tenant or household. You must also identify a deadline that the tenant must find an eligible unit. And lastly, minimum tenant contribution. You must establish one, and it can be a percentage of the tenant's income or a dollar amount. We most commonly see a minimum contributions of $10 or $20, $25, or $50. Affirmative marketing plan, forgot about that one. The last programmatic requirement we are going to discuss is the affirmative marketing plan. The objective of affirmative marketing is to ensure that home administrators design and employ marketing plans that promote fair housing by ensuring outreach to all potentially eligible households, especially those least likely to apply for assistance. Affirmative marketing consists of actions to provide information and otherwise attract eligible persons without regard to race, color, national origin, sex, religion, or familial status. LPAs must develop an affirmative marketing plan that relies on local knowledge and decision-making in order to determine the best strategies for compliance. The affirmative marketing plan must include the following elements listed on the screen. I'm not going to go into each one as they are covered in the general admin plan, but I did want to provide more information on what is meant by least likely to apply and how to identify that. So your plan needs to identify a specific group or groups of people who may need special outreach to be made aware of and apply for your TBRA program. Typically, this is based on census data and is geared towards a small percentage of your population, such as a specific race or national origin. Outreach to the least likely to apply population includes specific community organizations, places of worship, employment centers, fair housing groups, or housing counseling agencies that will serve the specified population. Again, there's more information available in the general admin plan. And then before I turn it over to Courtney, are there any questions, Marge?
None so far, but folks can enter questions in the chat, and we have regular intervals where we'll stop and check in.
All right, thank you, Sarah. So now we're going to get into the specifics of each individual tenant file. We're going to go through what a file must contain in the general order of operations. The first step is determining income eligibility. If the tenant already has a unit picked out and knows the rent, you can also determine the monthly subsidy at this step. Once you determine the tenant is income eligible, you may sign the tenant agreement. Next, you will have to inspect the unit to ensure it meets the housing quality standards and determine the rent is reasonable. Last, you'll sign the landlord agreement. We're going to go through each step in more detail. As I mentioned, the first thing you should document when assessing a tenant's eligibility is their income. They must meet the income requirements in order to be eligible for TBRA. There are 5 main components of income eligibility. The first component is the area median income limit. TBRA is capped at 60% AMI, but this is different than our other activities, which are allowed to go up to 80% AMI. Next, there are 2 methods to determining income eligibility. There's the Section 8 Part 5 method and the IRS 1040 method. The 1040 method may seem simpler to use as you only have to collect the 1040 form and input the information into the CPD calculator. However, under home regulations, income documentation is only good for 6 months. After 6 months, it is considered outdated and you must collect additional source documentation to support the income on the 1040. If the current income is different than the 1040, then you'd have to use the Part 5 method and current income documentation to determine eligibility. For that reason, we prefer the use of the Part 5 method since the income documentation collected would always reflect their current income. Whichever method you do pick, you should stick to for the duration of your contract with us. The next component is source documentation. You must collect a minimum of 2 months worth of source documentation. If using the 1040 method, you would collect the IRS 1040 form. If using the Part 5 method, some examples of source documentation include pay stubs, a letter from an employer, Social Security letter, or retirement letter. If you need to collect additional documentation to support the 1040, you could use any of the examples I just listed, or whatever the applicable documentation is for their income. Next, as I previously mentioned, income documentation and determination is valid for 6 months. If 6 months has passed since you verified their income and a tenant agreement has not been signed, then you must recertify the tenant with updated source documentation. The last component to note is inclusions and exclusions. There are some sources of income that are to be excluded when determining eligibility. It's important to review the income and asset inclusion and exclusion list from HUD. An example of an exclusion is that only certain amounts of employment income from full-time students is to be counted towards the household income. So to be sure to review the list and ask your PM if you're unsure. Next slide, please. We require the use of the HUD CPD eligibility calculator, CPD income eligibility calculator, to determine income eligibility for all home activities. The calculator is located on the HUD Exchange. I'm not going to go into depth on how to use the annual and adjusted income portions of the calculator during this training. However, we have a presentation on the CPD calculator on the OCR website under office hours recordings. If you have any questions, please reach out to your PM or you can email the home mailbox. And I'm going to put a link in the chat to the OCR website. After determining the annual and adjusted income, the calculator will prompt you to select a rental model to determine the monthly subsidy amount. While it may seem intuitive to select the TBRA model, you do have to select the voucher model. For the purposes of home TBRA, the regulations require the voucher model. Next slide. Before getting into the voucher model, it's important to understand what a payment standard is. The payment standard is what is used to help determine the allowable monthly subsidy. Payment standards are based on location and the number of bedrooms in the unit. It is also inclusive of the rent plus utilities. Payment standards must be between 80 to 100% of the fair market rent, and most LPAs end up using 100% of the FMR. However, there are community-wide exemptions. Many Section 8 administrators receive approval to use payment standards that exceed 100% of the FMR. Typically, we see this closer to the city where rent can be extremely high. You can use your local Section 8 approved FMR, but we do need to see documentation of their approval. So you can reach out to your local Section 8 administrator and request a copy of their approval from HCR. Next slide, please. Now that we understand what a payment standard is, we can review how the voucher model works. The voucher model calculates the subsidy by determining the difference between the payment standard and 30% of the tenant's adjusted income. For example, if a payment standard is $2,000 and 30% of the tenant's adjusted income is $600, home will pay $1,400 towards their rent per month. Slide. Since the monthly subsidy is based on the payment standard, the rent charged by the owner may be less than or greater than the payment standard. These are two examples of the rent being less than or greater than the payment standard. So on the left, you can see the rent is less than the payment standard, and this is fairly common. So in this example, the payment standard is $1,300. 30% of the adjusted income is $285, and the rent is $1,150. This leaves the monthly subsidy at $1,015, and the tenant portion is $135. On the right, you can see the rent is greater than the payment standard. So the payment standard is still $1,300, and their income is still $285. But the rent is $1,380. So that means the monthly subsidy is still $1,015, but the tenant portion increased to $356 to cover the additional rent. In some scenarios, the maximum subsidy is equal to or greater than the rent charged by the owner, because the tenant's income could be significantly low or the rent is significantly cheaper than the payment standard. When that happens, the CPD calculator will show the tenant portion is 0. However, as Sarah mentioned earlier, in the tenant selection plan, the tenant still needs to contribute a minimum tenant portion. If the CPD calculator shows a tenant portion of 0, then you would cross the 0 out and write in the tenant portion, and then cross out the subsidy and subtract out the tenant minimum. I know this section can be confusing, so I'm just going to pause here if there's any questions on income and payment standard before we move on to the next topic.
Courtney, someone had a little confusion about verifying income. She asked, so you verify income every 6 months. Maybe you can clarify that piece of the presentation.
Yeah, so once you sign an agreement with a tenant, you only have to verify their income annually, so once a year. But before you sign the tenant agreement, you have to verify their income. And sometimes there's a gap between verifying the income and signing the tenant agreement. And basically, if 6 months has passed from the time you verified their income, then you have to re-verify their income before signing the written agreement. Once you sign the written agreement, then everything is like secured and you don't have to verify their income for another 12 months. Any other questions on income and payment standards? Doesn't look like anybody had anything else in the chat, but feel free to continue to put questions in the chat. So I'm going to move on to one more topic before passing it back to Sarah. All right, so this brings us to the next step in the process, which is the tenant agreement. Once you determine the tenant is income eligible, then you can sign the tenant agreement. The tenant agreement is between the LPA and the tenant. It commits home funding to the tenant, not the unit. You can think of TBRA similar to a housing choice voucher. The tenant can use the voucher in any unit they choose and are not limited to a specific unit or building. The landlord agreement, which we'll get to later, commits funds to the unit. So a tenant agreement can be a maximum of 24 months at a time. It can be renewed based on availability of home funds and the needs of the tenant. In other words, you can renew the tenant for an additional 24 months after the expiration of the current rent agreement. However, TBRA is meant to be temporary and typically used while they're on the Section 8 waiting list. But we understand that the waiting list can be years long. The date that the tenant signs the written agreement is considered the written agreement date. And this is the date that you should be using on the setup form when you submit it to IDIS. Some other important things to note are that the tenant agreement can be signed prior to the landlord agreement, but the landlord agreement cannot be signed prior to the tenant agreement. Also, the tenant agreement cannot extend beyond your home contract with us unless you have another executed home contract with HTFC and available funds. Any questions on the tenant agreement? See anything in the chat, so I'll pass it back to Sarah, who's going to talk about inspections and unit approvals. You're muted.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to inspections, I just wanted to take a moment and review sort of what we've already covered in this presentation. So by the time you're doing the inspections, you've already received your Tier 1 clearance and your authority to use grant funds. You've developed your tenant selection plan and your affirmative marketing plan. You know what type of assistance you're going to be providing. You've income qualified the tenant or the household, and you've signed the tenant agreement. Now the tenant has identified a unit, so the next step is qualifying the unit through the inspections. There are 3 required inspections for TBRA, which we'll go over. Next slide, please. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Tier 2 environmental review. So as I mentioned earlier, the environmental review is a tiered process. You've already received your Tier 1 at this point, which is programmatic review, and now you're on to the Tier 2, which is completed for each unit. So upon approval of your Tier 1, administrators are provided their Tier 2 checklist by our environmental unit. Once the tenant has identified the unit, you must complete the Tier 2 checklist. This must be done prior to signing the landlord agreement. Not-for-profits must submit the Tier 2 checklist to HCR's environmental unit for review and approval. Municipalities are considered the responsible entity, so they are responsible for ensuring the Tier 2 clearance for their own program. This means you aren't submitting it to our environmental unit for approval, but you must complete and approve the review on your own. And this is the same for any other of the home activities for municipalities. One thing to note is some of the 2024 contracts, if you're participating in this webinar, you might have resolved all your items during the Tier 1 review and do not require a Tier 2 review. If you aren't sure if this applies to you, reach out to your project manager. Next slide, please. In addition to the Tier 2 review, any unit receiving home assistance must comply with the Housing Quality Standards, or HQS. HQS defines standard housing and establishes the minimum criteria necessary for health and safety of the program participants. The HQS is based on 13 components listed on the screen. TBRA administrators should strive to ensure consistency among inspectors in areas where specific guidance is not provided and therefore relies on the judgment of the TBRA inspector. The unit must be inspected by a knowledgeable staff or professional prior to signing the landlord agreement. Also, this cannot be filled out by the landlord. It has to be done by somebody associated with the LPA. If the unit does not pass, you must work with the landlord and request any repairs needed, or the unit is not eligible for home funds. There are 2 different documents you can use to meet this requirement. There's a form or a checklist. We recommend, if you do not have much experience with the housing quality standards, that you utilize the form because it provides a little more information and guidance. If you're familiar with it, you can probably just use the checklist, and that will be sufficient for you. Either is fine as long as it's filled out correctly and the unit passes the inspection. If you're providing more than 12 months of assistance, the HQS inspection must be conducted annually. Next slide, please. Lead-based paint. I thought the lead-based paint requirements could best be explained through a flow chart. So the first question you're going to ask yourself is if the unit was built before 1978, yes or no. If no, the unit is exempt from lead-based paint requirements. The date of the unit should be indicated on the HQS form and used as the backup documentation for this exemption. If yes, you're going to continue to the next question, which is if there are or will be children under the age of 6 in the unit. If no, the tenant must be provided the Protect Your Family from Lead pamphlet, and the owner must disclose any lead-based paint hazards. There are some HUD forms available for this. If the answer is yes, a visual assessment must be conducted in addition to supplying the pamphlet and the disclosure. The person completing the visual assessment must have taken the HUD visual assessment training. So to summarize, the lead-based paint visual inspections are only required in units that were built prior to 1978 and have or will have children under the age of 6 living in the unit. Next slide, please. Okay, rent reasonableness. Now you've completed all the required inspections, you need to determine that the rent being charged by the landlord is reasonable. This is done by comparing the unit selected by the tenant to other similar units in the area. Again, HUD has a form for this if you don't have one of your own. If it's determined that the rent is not reasonable, the unit is not eligible for home funding. Any questions on inspections before we turn it over?
If there's one here asking if Inspire inspections would be acceptable in place of HQS.
That is part of the new final rule. However, we aren't implementing that until probably later in the fall, but obviously we'll keep everyone informed when we make those changes.
That's all the questions.
Anything else? Okay.
Nope.
All righty. So now that you have determined that the tenant and the unit are eligible, you can sign the landlord agreement. The landlord agreement must begin on the first day of the lease. If the tenant is in the middle of their lease and the landlord doesn't want to begin a new lease, then you could use the TBRA addendum to bypass this requirement. Additionally, the landlord agreement can only go as long as the lease. So if you enter into an agreement mid-lease and there's only 6 months left on the lease, the landlord agreement cannot exceed 6 months. Another requirement is that the landlord agreement cannot exceed the tenant agreement. Sometimes you may see situations where you sign a 24-month agreement with the tenant, but the lease is only 12 months. Therefore, the landlord agreement would be 12 months as well. The landlord agreement the landlord agreement includes a section on the rent, the subsidy, and the tenant portion. So you want to make sure that this matches the CPD voucher and the setup form. And then last, the agreement must be signed by both the landlord and the LPA. Next slide, please. Along with signing the landlord agreement, there are a few disclosures that must be provided to the tenant. The flood history and damage notice needs to be filled out and signed by the landlord and the tenant. This documents if the unit is in a flood zone and if there has been any previous damage to the unit because of flooding. Next is information regarding the source of income discrimination law in New York State. We do have a template of this in the TBRA admin plan, or you can download the pamphlet from the New York State Division of Human Rights website. Either way, you need some kind of receipt that you provided this to the tenant. It could be a copy of an email that you send them, the tenant initialing the pamphlet, or you creating your own receipt. Last is the Violence Against Women Act addendum. You must use the HCR version of this, and you can find a copy on the HCR's Fair and Equitable Housing Office website. Next slide. Now that your file is complete, you may set it up in IDIS. Each activity or household must be set up in IDIS by emailing the setup form to the IDIS mailbox. Before setting up your first household, you must complete the first file review. And the purpose of this is to assess for regulatory compliance and provide any technical assistance needed. Generally, a file is ready once you determine they are income eligible, the unit passed the HQS inspections and lead-based paint visual assessment if applicable, rent is reasonable, the lease was reviewed and approved, the unit received Tier 2 environmental clearance, and all written agreements are complete. Next slide. So this is a portion of the setup and completion form, which is available on our home website. We wanted to point out a few key things about the setup form. If you are also providing utility assistance, it must be included in the TBRA rent subsidy line. If you plan to disperse for project delivery, you must include it on the setup form. And it should be a consistent amount since you know the monthly subsidy and about how many months you're going to be providing assistance. All setups and completion forms get emailed to our IDIS mailbox. And when setting in a setup, you must include the setup form, the landlord agreement, and Tier 2 approval letter or Tier 2 checklist if you are a municipality. Next slide. Home is a reimbursement program, therefore you must front the rental assistance. This is an example of our disbursement form for TBRA. The disbursement form should match the amounts listed on the setup form and what you have previously requested. The total balance after the request will auto-populate. You can only request the current month and 1 month in advance. For example, if you're submitting a disbursement today, You could request May's subsidy plus June's as well. On the disbursement form, you will enter the total amount of monthly subsidies that you are requesting and the monthly subsidies left. The third section is where you will enter the specific amount you are requesting, which include a security deposit, utility assistance, rental subsidy, project delivery, and soft costs. Unless you're requesting project delivery or soft cost, no supporting documentation is required for TBRA disbursements. Project delivery requires the use of PARs, also known as personnel activity reports, as supporting documentation, and soft costs require invoices as supporting documentation. Once you completed filling out the disbursement workbook, the disbursement package gets emailed to our disbursement mailbox. We ask that you provide the disbursement forms and supporting documentation in a single PDF. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, tenant agreements can be amended or renewed. The tenant agreement can be amended if the lease was amended or renewed, but only if it was to update the term of the lease and or the rent charged. A tenant agreement can also be amended to extend it up to 24 months from the original agreement date. For example, if you signed an agreement for 12 months but want to extend the agreement, you can. As a reminder, a tenant agreement cannot exceed 24 months at a time. So once a 24-month agreement is expired, a new agreement must be executed. Last, an agreement can be amended if a tenant changes units within the same building or complex, if the parties to the lease, the family size, and the number of bedrooms remain the same. Once the tenant agreement expires, you may renew assistance to a tenant by signing a new written agreement. Regardless of the length of the agreement, the tenant's income must be re-examined annually. Additionally, the unit must be inspected annually to ensure it still meets the housing quality standards. And last, owners may adjust rents as leases are renewed, so be sure to review the new lease and rent to ensure it remains in compliance with home regulations. Next slide. As a recap, today we covered program rules and regulations, the order of operations for tenant files, an overview of setups and completions, and an overview of disbursements. TBRA can be an intimidating program to run because of all the intricate details. However, I have seen many LPAs come in with minimal experience and excel at administering administering their program after receiving some technical assistance from us. As project managers, we are here to guide you through the program and help in any way we can. Slide. So our next funding round is opening Thursday, July 17th, and is going to close Thursday, September 11th, precisely at 4 p.m. We have about $15 million to award this round, but please be aware that funds, are expressly conditioned on HTFC's receipt of home funds from HUD. All applications get submitted through the Community Development Online Application System, also referred to as CDOL. We have 2 application webinars coming up. The first is Strengthening Your Application, Support for New and Emerging Applicants. This webinar is geared towards applicants who have either never applied but have not been funded, or applicants who simply want to strengthen their application. We will go into detail about application requirements and give tips on how to best answer questions through the application. The webinar is scheduled for June 3rd at 1 p.m. and we will send out a registration link in the near future. The other webinar is our general application webinar. This is not scheduled yet, but usually takes place soon after the funding round opens. And this is a more basic overview of the application process and does not go into a ton of detail. If you are a newer applicant, we do encourage you to register for both webinars. With that said, does anybody have any questions? Feel free to enter in the chat, and we are here to answer your questions.
If there's one in here about, can you confirm that the admin plan contains eligible project delivery and soft costs, i.e. examples and lists? And maybe you could explain the difference, that some information is in our general plan and some is in the activity specific TBRA admin plan.
Yeah, in our general admin plan, we have a bunch of information on disbursements and what are eligible costs. So definitely check that out and let us know if you have any specific questions. Project delivery is you can bill for the time you spent on the specific activity. And then soft costs are usually items that help support the delivery of the assistance. So you could, charge a flat fee for the housing inspection that you do, or if you have like an outside consultant working on the project, that could be something that gets billed as soft costs. Not a lot of soft costs are billed through TBRA because there's not a lot of outside vendors coming in. It's usually just, doing the paperwork and providing the assistance. But yeah, definitely check out our admin plan, both the general and the TBRA. They'll have a little bit more information in there. Does anybody have any other questions?
We have a question here. Has there been much success in enlisting tenants from Section 8? I know many people are not willing to give up their place on the waiting list.
I believe they stay on the waiting list. So they aren't really giving their spot up. You're just providing the assistance until they get their voucher.
Right, yeah, this is meant to be like a placeholder, per se, until they can get the Section 8, because Section 8 can take a while. But it looks like Stephanie wanted to maybe chime in.
Sorry, I was clicking the button and didn't mean to. But yes, that answer is correct. It doesn't affect them on the Section 8 waiting list.
Do you see somebody asked about slides? And yeah, we can send out a copy of the slides.
And we can post them on the website as well with a recording once it's uploaded. Yeah. We got a question here. As a nonprofit, we have a tenant that lives in the property and falling behind on rent. Would these tenants be appropriate for the program?
It's a great question. So you have to be current on your rent. The funds for the rental assistance can't go towards back rent, so they have to be current on their rent. But that brings up another point, is that as an LPA, if you own property, you are allowed to provide rental assistance to tenants in your own property. You just have to document that the tenant chose that apartment, and it wasn't, forced upon them to move into that apartment.
Here we have another question. If there is a local housing authority that already processed Section 8 applications, would they generally be considered to be the best qualified applicant for TBRA compared to a local not-for-profit organization?
I can try to answer that one, but anybody else feel free to weigh in. I think, again, this program was designed for people waiting on their Section 8 voucher. So ideally, even if you are a nonprofit that gets awarded it, your first kind of go-to should be to the Section 8 administrator and start with that list, because those people have already been income qualified and they've done some of the legwork for you. That being said, you don't have to use that list. You know, it's kind of up to you, but that's sort of how the program is structured. So yeah, using, you know, starting with the wait list of people for their voucher is a good idea.
I think they're also to ask, like, if there would be a better administrator compared to a local not-for-profit.
Sarah, can you answer, like, if there's any competitive advantage between a not-for-profit and a housing authority as far as maybe applying and administering?
Sure. So I'm guessing the housing authority would have more experience, you know, dealing with tenants and providing assistance and income qualifying people. So, you know, assuming they write a strong application, they would probably do better, but it's hard to say. Again, we do have nonprofits that administer it, but typically they are either also administering the Section 8 program or are working closely with that agency.
Right, and we evaluate each application, you know, as it's presented. So just making sure that if you have extensive experience with Section 8 and how that, you know, relates to TBRA administration, that would help your application.
Yeah, just to add to that too, the funding rounds for, you know, home and our other local activities are competitive. So if a local housing authority comes in and then a nonprofit comes in, you know, we're not going to award the housing authority just because they're a housing authority. We award based on, you know, your capacity, your knowledge of the program and whatnot. And also, I see there's another question. They don't have to be on the Section 8 waiting list. That's just a common occurrence that happens. But I will say that TBRA is meant to be, you know, temporary or transitional. It's not supposed to be a permanent solution. So they don't have to be on the Section 8 waiting list, but if they're not on the Section 8 waiting list, then ideally, you know, you're working towards them being independent on their own.
We have a question here. Will the webinars be offered in multiple languages? We don't have plans for multiple language webinars, so no. Again, these are webinars for not-for-profit organizations and applicants to our funding round, not to beneficiaries specifically. Don't see any other questions, so we can wait a minute just to see if any more come through. Thank you. Thank you all for coming and listening. Oh, we have one more question. Most environmental reports take multiple review and approvals and can be costly depending on the property. Is there a way to claim that expense?
I can answer that. So TBRA environmental reviews are very, very simple. After you get the tier one review is more in depth, which you'll work with our environmental unit to get that review completed. And then there's the tier 2 review. And usually for that, it's like asking, are you near an airport, like a coastal, or there's one other question. It's like very, very brief. But you can submit a disbursement for administrative funds for the tier 1 review. And then you can also submit a disbursement for either project delivery or like a flat fee rate for soft cost to that specific tenant.
So just to add, because TBRA isn't, doing any sort of ground disturbance, the environmental review is, like, as Courtney said, much simpler. So if you're used to doing, a rehab program with us, that tier 2 is more in-depth and detailed than the one for the tenant-based rental program. And also, when you complete your tier 1 review and it is approved, our environmental unit sends you like the checklist of what you will have to, basically the maps you'll have to look at for that review.
Well, I'll just add, if there's no other questions, to definitely reach out to our home mailbox. We really want, for you guys to apply and be funded. So please reach out with questions. It does look like there's one more question. Where can we get the application package? So that's going to be posted on our home website closer to when the application funding run opens, which I think I said it was like July 17th. So keep an eye on our website. We'll have all the information up there, the instructions, all that. And we're going to, like I said, have some more webinars as well. And we will be sure to include you guys on the invitations.
To add that their old application from last year is still on our website. So groups can look at that to get an idea of what this year's might look like. I don't expect that there will be any huge major changes.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining today.